Those who are troubled by our existing programs are not interested in repeating the tragedy of 9/11. And those who defend these programs are not dismissive of civil liberties. The challenge is getting the details right, and that is not simple.
He really didn't announce that he's going to quit collecting anything. They're going to continue to collect your phone records, your emails, your text messages, and many people think they're collecting your credit card statements too. So that doesn't sound to me like he's really going to change. He gave a lot of sort of, I guess, rosy rhetoric about how he was going to do a better job at protecting privacy, but he didn't announce that he was going to do any less collection of our personal records.
Well, mixed reaction. Some of the NSA reforms announced by the president today. The FISA court approval for all of the phone records before the NSA can pull any phone records from the database. 3 hops to 2 hops for degrees of separation from the original number. We'll explain that in a minute. Phone records database out of the government control. This one is a little ambiguous. Public advocates to represent consumers before the FISA court. Before we hit the panel, the ACLU came out with a statement about the president's proposed changes, saying this: the president's decision not to end bulk collection and retention of all Americans' data remains highly troubling. The president outlined a process to study the issue further and appears open to alternatives, but the president should end, not mend, the government's collection and retention of all law-abiding Americans' data. Let's bring in our panel. Jason Riley, editorial board member of the Wall Street Journal. Charles Lane, opinion writer for the Washington Post, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. Charles.
Well, the ACLU and Ron DePaul are right, which is why it was a terrific speech. It was 90% smoke and mirrors and very little substantive change, which is what we need. In fact, it was the best use of Obama's rhetorical powers of dazzling with very little content since the 2008 campaign. Look, Obama knows he has to retain the program. It is extremely important. But he made enough rhetoric and enough nods to the other side, at least philosophically, and enough cosmetic changes to make it look as if he did something. But if you look at all the points you mentioned, they are really unimportant in the overall scheme. It doesn't matter who keeps the records. What matters is, do you collect them, and is it kept somewhere? Answer, yes. True, you're going to have to go through the FISA court to access it, except in an emergency. So anytime you really need it, no court. And if you've got time on your hands, so you'll have a procedure, and you'll almost always end up with access. They're going to add an advocate, a privacy advocate, who will plead in the FISA court. But it seems as if only in novel cases and not in routine ones. Big deal. Overall, I'd give him an A-, and if I were a lefty, I'd be really upset.
All right, Bing is all over the place here. A lot of people weighing in. Privacy versus security. Which do you value more? Privacy, 66%, security, 34%. Do you think the NSA has too much power? Yes, 89%, no, 11%. President Obama's NSA changes go too far, 15%, do not go far enough, 78%, are about right, 7%. The voting's still coming in, Chuck. And actually, lawmakers were all over the board on reaction today, too.
I think the president did something very important that a number of us, and I think the intelligence establishment itself, have been waiting for him to do, which is defend the NSA in principle. And he stood up there and he said, essentially, they are the lineal descendants of the intelligence organizations that have protected America in the past, and he specifically cited the codebreakers of World War II, et cetera. In other words, he embraced the NSA far more warmly and more forthrightly than he'd ever done before. And I think that was, to me, the most important atmospheric symbol in this whole thing, because after all, he is the commander-in-chief of this organization. They work for him, and he left a lot of ambiguity, especially by appointing a review committee that essentially called for eviscerating them. Now, here's the thing. Everybody in America, here's the downside of this speech to me. Everybody in America seems to have a firm opinion about what ought to be done with this metadata, except for the President of the United States, who wants to just like kick the decision off to somebody else. And that's the hole that he left in this otherwise pretty forthright
Pretty
speech.
big hole, though, on that particular point, Jason. I mean, he's saying he wants the Attorney General to come up with some recommendation before March 28th when the program has to be reauthorized. And the metadata is to go someplace, but not in government control, and the phone companies say they don't want to hold it.
And he wants Congress to get involved in deciding who that third party might be who will hold this data. He sounded very conflicted to me. Yes, he praised the NSA. He said there's no evidence of malfeasance there, yet we need to rein in this agency. He tried to be all things to all people. We need to collect the data, but we'll have a third party hold it. My concern about the congressional role that we could get here is that we could get legislation that weakens the executive branch, not only for the rest of Obama's term, but for his successor. And there are terrorists out there trying to kill us, and tracking them, surveilling them is important. And if, to the extent that that leaves the executive branch weaker in its efforts to do that, that does bother me.
Now, Britt Hume mentioned that there is no aggrieved party as of yet, Charles. But take a listen to the former CIA director, Mike Morrell, talking about what this metadata actually shows, what you can get from this metadata.
There is quite a bit of content in metadata. I mean, when you have the records of the phone calls that a particular individual made, you can learn an awful lot about that person. And that's one of the things that struck me. So there's not, in my mind, a sharp distinction between metadata and content. It's more of a continuum.
I mean, that seems to go towards the people who are very concerned about this collection.
Look, of course, it's extremely powerful. But it exists. The phone companies have it every day and have had it for years. The NSA has had it for a decade, and there is not one case. We got 300 million Americans. There's not one reported case of the abuse of this, any intentional abuse.
But Charles, we
which is a
wouldn't know
pretty
about
good
this if
record.
it wasn't for Edward Snowden. We wouldn't know about any of this.
But if there were a single case of a person who was injured, we would have heard about it, and we haven't. So look, we all agree that the power is there. I would say, a lot of us think that it has to be accessible. Had we had this when we had the phone call of the 9/11 attacker from San Diego to a known terrorist address in Europe before 9/11, we would have stopped 9/11. We are going to have a second attack. It could be a small one like the Boston attack or a large one like 9/11. But we are going to have one, and if we have eviscerated the program, a lot of people, including the ones who eviscerated it, will regret it highly.
It's interesting you mentioned 9/11. The president mentioned 9/11 numerous times today. To hear him talk 9/11 was really interesting compared to Senator Obama talking about warrantless wiretap. I mean, a lot has changed in 5 years.
Yes, and even as compared to President Obama on other occasions, he has spoken about taking this country off of its war footing. And that's why I was a little surprised at the tone he took today, because he seemed to be saying, well, you know, we kind of have to sort of stay on a war footing, at least with respect to these NSA programs. And I just want to say one point about Mr. Morrell. I mean, yeah, the fact that they're revealing, I don't think is what's at issue here. The question is whether they are, in a constitutional sense, something you have a right to keep private. And that's not true. I mean, the Supreme Court has already held that metadata is not, you don't have a privacy right in metadata. Now, until the day they overturn that, and I understand some lower courts have gone after it lately, that is still a fair game for the government.
Yeah, they're stayed until appeal.
The president also seemed very irritated and frustrated to me in this speech, and it came across in his persona at Snowden, at Russia, at China, all of whom he mentioned by name, but also at having to give this speech, and at the American people for not trusting him the way he thinks they ought to trust him. But of course, why are we going to trust him? After Benghazi, after the IRA, after the lies on Obamacare, he's created this environment out there, but he seemed a little irritated to me.
Last thing, quickly, not going to listen in on Chancellor Merkel's personal conversations, but not going to stop listening to foreign countries make their decisions.
I think that's exactly the right spot where you want to draw the line. Her dating habits, okay. We're not going to look into that, of course, unless There is an exception unless there's a national security threat involved. Otherwise, we scoop up everything said overseas. That's exactly why we have spy agencies. Scoop up every bit of micro data so we know what's going on.
Next up, the Friday Lightning Round.